API Testing and Development with Postman, published by Packt. Dave brings years of hands-on experience in both testing and development, with a particular focus on solving automation challenges in team settings. He's worked across from integrating third-party APIs to scaling quality efforts in mature systems, and is deeply invested in using automation to build better software. Today, he's here with us to talk about his book, The Evolving API Testing Landscape, and what it takes to scale testing in today's tooling ecosystem. A very warm welcome to you, Dave, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here to talk about this topic. I'm always passionate about APIs and API testing.
Okay, looking forward to it. So let's start with your book. The second edition was published in June 2024, which wasn't too long ago, actually. But things have changed with the advent of AI and all that. What core ideas or techniques in the book that you published do you think still remain just as relevant despite of all the big changes we are seeing almost on a monthly basis, compared to what you envisioned when you started the book with? So what parts of it you feel still remain indispensable?
Yeah, it really is a changing world out there. I mean, software has always been rapidly changing, but it feels like the last year or two, it's an entirely new trajectory that we've shot off on. And the reality is, this in this changing world, like, there are some things that change, but there are some things that are timeless too. I think there's some testing principles that they were valid in the 80s before the consumer internet was even a thing, and they're valid in the world of desktop and internet computing, and they're valid today in the world of AI and APIs. So I think some examples of these kinds of things are like system thinking. And what I mean by that is like the ability to kind of understand how the piece that you're testing fits into the entire ecosystem, the entire problem that you're trying to solve, seeing where it fits into that application, understanding how it intersects with the customer needs, and being able to take that system view, that ability to zoom out and see the entire forest, and then to come back in and see the tree and realize how it fits into that entire ecosystem and how to approach thinking about it and testing it. So I think that's one example of something that is a timeless truth that I've tried to capture in my book. And I think some things also, like how to think about an approach and structure your testing, is kind of timeless when it comes to RESTful APIs. They haven't fundamentally changed in the last 20 years, and neither should the way that you think about testing them. So, when you think about things like endpoint testing versus workflow testing, and understanding the difference between them and how you should structure your tests when you're trying to test those different in those different ways, or thinking about exploratory testing, when to do that, when to automate, when to put regression testing in, and kind of understanding the trade-offs between those different scenarios, and when to use each one. So I think there's a lot of timeless truths that I've tried to capture in that book. And then, of course, there's some things that have changed as well. Like Postman as a tool is continuing to evolve and add new features. And, of course, the elephant in the room right now in any tech conversation is AI. And Postman, they're trying to integrate some more AI into the tool itself. And so I think that's something that could be really useful to explore beyond the book. You read through the book and get that grounding, and then take it and move beyond that to look at some of the new AI tools that they have. And I think we'll talk a bit more about that. I assume we will later in this conversation about the intersection of AI and API testing.
Yeah, yes. And in fact, let's sort of jump into that right away, actually. So talking about, we start by talking a little bit about Postman's AI assistant, Postbot, which now generates tests and scripts. So, with that context, do you see AI becoming a reliable partner in real-world API testing, or does testing in the enterprise context still need very strong human oversight, according to you?
Yeah, so I actually think it's kind of both. I think AI presents some different opportunities. So, and I would even structure this or frame this in the sense of skilled practitioners, those that have a lot of experience and have been testing for a long time, versus newer entrants to the field, right? A more junior tester, someone who's earlier on in their career. And I think there's like thinking about how to use AI effectively in those different situations is important. So like for a skilled tester, a skilled practitioner who's got a lot of experience, I think these AI tools can help you move more quickly on the things that you need to do. So often, when you get to that level, you've done a lot of different testing. You can kind of look at something and say, okay, this is what I need to do here. But it can be a bit repetitive, maybe to implement some scripts or to write things that you want, or you kind of want to get this data and you need to generate a script that will help you do that, whatever it is. But often you kind of know what you need to do, and AI, you can use it to like help you move faster, right? And then you can look at what it generates, you can review it, you can tweak it. You have the experience to be able to evaluate whether or not it is doing a good job. And I think that's a really important part. That's where we need these experienced practitioners that can work with these AI systems to make sure that they are solving the real problems that we need, and that they're doing so in a way that's safe, especially in business corporate contexts. But I think on the flip side, for more junior people, there's a bit of a temptation to kind of use AI to like auto-generate your scripts, but you might not understand what the scripts that it gives you are doing. And I think when you're early on in your career, that's a little bit the wrong way to use AI, because you're going to end up getting to the point where the AI gets stuck, and then you're really going to struggle to get past that. And I think in my experience, this AI, it doesn't give you like maintainable scripts. It doesn't give you maintainable setups. So it kind of just generates some stuff, and it's a little bit, let's say, random. And then, later on down the road, when you're trying to maintain that, when you're trying to run it multiple times, when you're trying to add to it or change it, you end up getting really stuck and bogged down. So I think instead, if you're earlier on in your career, more junior, in the first couple of years of your career, focus on using AI to help you learn. Let it generate some of that stuff. Look at that, be like, okay, I want to actually understand. Ask it, what does this mean? Why are you doing it this way? Can you explain this thing to me? And use it more as a learning tool rather than a like autocomplete tool. So I think there's it can be a reliable partner, but it does need some evaluation. It can be a great tool, but you do need to use it well. And I think that's where the balance and kind of both comes into my answer.
Yeah, and that's sort of like a recurring warning we're sort of coming across in conversations we're having about not using AI without, building the experience that someone who's been longer in the industry has, without having checks and balances in place. So thank you for that insight. Now, let's talk about Postman supporting gRPC, WebSockets, and GraphQL. How should testers adapt their approach when working with protocols compared to REST?
Yeah. So I think, again, just to go back, there are some fundamental things that stay the same, right? We talked about systems testing. There's some things that stay the same regardless of what kind of system you're testing. And so taking some of those general testing principles, you can always apply them. But I think when you get to these different protocols, there are definitely differences in the nitty gritty detail of how you want to go about this when you compare it to REST. So, like for example, if you consider gRPC, it tends to give you kind of a lower level access, right? It is remote procedure calls. You're calling a method directly on another computer, and so it lets you kind of access code at a lower level of abstraction than a REST endpoint does. And I think this gives increases the kinds of things that you can do and the ways that you can combine those things, and then even the impact that you can have on the underlying system. So I think one area where you see a big change with how to think about testing these other types of more modern, let's say, APIs is the way that you think about test coverage. So how are you going to get adequate test coverage on this? The way that you structure that, the way that you think about that is going to be different than the way that you would do that with a REST API. But then on the flip side, there are some similar challenges. For example, I think if you are using, say, gRPC again, if you've got a protobuf or some kind of contract, it's easier to test it, just like with a RESTful API. If you've got an open API specification, it's easier to test it. So there's some things there where advocating for those kind of contracts stays the same regardless of these different types of APIs. But then I also think that like GraphQL, gRPC, they're similar in that you to test them adequately, you need to have a little bit more of an understanding of the underlying code. Whereas with a RESTful API, you can just kind of look at what's provided by the API itself and generally get a pretty good understanding of how to go about testing it. But like with GraphQL, for example, there's just a lot of different combinations of queries that you can do. And I think one way that this shows up even is, say, in documentation. So like a RESTful API, it'll have a pretty simple documentation generally. You can kind of document, here's all the endpoints, here's what each endpoint does, maybe a page or two on a website or something. You can kind of document out pretty thoroughly what a RESTful API does. But something like GraphQL, the documentation tends to be more dynamically generated. It's like autocomplete, and it you kind of almost need to explore through the graph to see some of the documentation that it has. It's harder to get comprehensive documentation. And that kind of points to the challenges, I think, of testing some of those systems as compared to RESTful APIs.
Yeah, got it. Thanks for that. Let's move on to talking about another development now. Reusable scripting and package libraries were introduced to reduce boilerplate. How do you recommend teams maintain reusable, scalable test logic as their API ecosystem grows?
Yeah, I think reusability it's a little bit of a two-edged sword when it comes to test automation. So like on the one hand, I'm very happy that Postman is doing this. I know in my book, I share some ways on how to make reusable scripting. And some of the ways that you had to do it in the past in Postman, it was a bit complicated. It was just kind of necessarily complicated because Postman didn't kind of provide native built-in support for this. So I'm really glad to see them building in some native solutions for this stuff. It is definitely a need. There is definitely times when you want to be able to share code across different scripts or across different collections. And so, yeah, I think the flip side of that is like we need to understand when to share. And as Postman makes it easier to do this, that side of it actually becomes a little bit more important to consider and to think about. You don't want to overuse that feature. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind here, a couple of considerations to have when you're thinking about this. So one thing is, like in general, automated tests, you want them to be independent of each other. That's not always true. There's certain times when you may have a series of tests, right? You're doing a workflow test or something like that. But in general, when you're thinking about automated testing, you want them to be able to run fairly independently. You want to be able to just run that one test if you want to, and not have your environment polluted by other tests or not have other test requirements. And so when you're sharing code across tests, you need to be considering that and making sure that you're doing it in a way that still allows your tests to run independently. And I think another thing is I've definitely seen this happen where you share too much code and something in that shared code breaks or something that shared code relies on breaks, and all of a sudden all your tests are failing, or hundreds of tests or dozens of tests, whatever it is. But you got lots and lots of tests that are failing just because of one little thing. And then it looks like, the whole system's down and and it turns out, no, it's just one small thing that we happen to have in our shared code. And so I think just being careful about that you don't kind of kill all your tests due to oversharing some code. And I think one consideration there is like sometimes just think about maybe if you got a bunch of shared code, maybe you could redo that as a mock instead. Maybe we don't need to keep calling, say, an auth endpoint every time to authenticate. If we don't actually need that, then in our tests, if we're not trying to test that particular functionality, if there was some way we could just insert credentials and go, that might be a better solution, where rather than calling the same endpoint multiple times across tests, we instead focus on mocking out the things that a test doesn't need. And that can help with efficiency as well. So if you have a shared code that is a bit slower and you're using this code over and over again, you're going to slow down your entire test system. And so I think that's just some of the risks of you overusing this functionality, and just something to be careful of. Another thing that I like to use tests as a form of documentation. So I think they're really valuable there. You can go look at a test and you can see, okay, this test does this. It says this should happen. It asserts this particular way of what ought to be going on. And you can read through that and you can understand what this system should be doing. You can kind of see a real life, not totally real life, it's a testing, but you can see a real life example of what ought to be happening and how the system ought to work. When you pull a lot of stuff out of a script into shared scripts, it gets harder to do that. You have to go, instead of just looking at your script and reading through it, you have to go find that shared library and look through that. And you have to kind of figure out, okay, that shared library fits in over here. And so it gets a little bit harder to do some of that, and kind of just read it through a test at a glance and understand what it is. So there's no trade-offs, right? It does save you some time, but we have to have these different trade-off considerations and make sure that we're using this shared scripting packaging libraries, make sure that we're using those effectively and efficiently and in a way that is going to help us be successful in the long run.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, Dave. Moving on to something else that's developed recently, contract testing and schema validation. What practical advice do you have for integrating both of these into CI workflows without slowing down development?
Yeah, I think to some extent, the point actually is to slow down development. And what I mean by that is that, if someone is developing a new endpoint or some new features and they're not conforming to the specification, that's not a good thing. We like, the whole point of having a specification is that it dictates this is the way that things ought to be done. This is the contract that we're going to adhere to, on the back end or on the front end or from a customer perspective, whatever it is. This is the contract that we're going to adhere to. And so if you're violating that contract, we need to say stop. Like, stop right now. That's not the contract we agreed to. You need to go back and fix this. And so there's a sense in which we do actually want to slow down. And I put it in air quotes there because it's obviously not in the long run slowing down. It's actually just improving the quality, and good quality in the long run does lead to faster development. But it's just putting that stop in there and saying, no. This is a contract. A contract means you have to respect it. You have to do what it says. So I think my practical advice for this is just to make sure that you do it as soon as possible in the workflow. So get it into your CI workflow as close as possible to where the developers are writing the code, because this is the kind of thing where if the developer has gone and spent a lot of time and built a bunch of things and then built some other stuff on top of that, and then you find out, oh no, you have a contract violation here. Often those kind of things require some kind of maybe more structural changes, a bit of a design change to how this endpoint is going to look, whatever that might be. And those kind of changes are tricky to make once you've built a lot of stuff on top of them. They're much easier to make if it's like, I just did this, I spent an hour or two, and now I find, oh shoot, I'm not conforming to the specification. Getting that information as early as possible helps to reduce like the slowing down of getting the feature out the door. And like I said, in the long run actually helps you speed it up because now you're building on a solid foundation. So that's one thing I would say is like, get it as close as possible. And these kind of tests, the schema checks, and even contract testing, if it's done well, they can run fairly quickly. And so I think you can run them, as part of like the developers merge CI, for example. So getting those things pushed as close as possible to the software changes, to the development changes, is important. Yeah, and I think that's probably the best way to keep it from slowing you down at a high level as much as possible.
Okay, got it. Brilliant. So now, how about mock servers and API virtualization, which are mainstream now? What are some smart use cases you've seen or perhaps implemented where mocking dramatically improved test coverage and development speed?
Yeah, I think a powerful way to use this is with third-party services. Um, you know, uh, it can be really tricky to test if you have an application that relies on third-party service. It can be really tricky to test against that because you probably don't want to or can't use the production version of the third-party service. Maybe the third-party service offers, some kind of sandbox environment or something that you can use for testing, but that's certainly not true of all of them. So, excuse me. So sometimes it's really, really difficult to actually test if you have a heavy reliance or a tightly coupled reliance on a third-party service. You almost have to like skip that entire part of the code. And I've seen that kind of thing happen where it's very difficult to do certain kinds of testing, even of code that's in your application, because it's just so tightly coupled with a third-party service. So if you can create a virtualization of that service or a mock of that service that allows you to do some, at least semi-realistic, like it allows you to at least execute that part of the code that your company has, your app has, that can be really, really valuable. So I would say third-party service mocking is a great place to use this. It can be a little tricky sometimes because depending on the third-party service, their API documentation may or may not be the greatest, but you should know what your integration uses, the way that you are interacting with it. And so you can create a virtualization for those endpoints and for the way that your application wants to work with it. And then that can also be really helpful for testing error flows. So often it can be really hard to test error flows against a service that you don't have control over. If it's an internal service, you could insert some, error logic or some testing, conditions inside the service that can allow you to test those error flows against your own service, coordinate with other teams or whatever. It's possible to do that. But when you're dealing with an external service, they don't want to expose error conditions on purpose. And so it can be very difficult to test those error flows unless you create a mock that you can have that mock return back an error flow under certain circumstances. And so that can allow you to test how your app will handle error flows. And I think as testers, we all appreciate that. Don't just do the happy path testing. We want to see what happens when things break, because that's when things get interesting. So I think that's a great way to use mocking. And I would say also, like if you have a specification, an API specification, open API spec, whatever it is, there's some pretty interesting stuff now that you can do around auto-generating some mock servers from those. And so that's just an interesting set of tools there as well that can really help with getting at least the basic infrastructure for it spun up pretty quickly, where you can kind of create a mock server fairly quickly just directly from a specification. Postman has some stuff built in for that now too. And there's other tools on the market as well that can help you with that. So I think that's a great way to use and think about mock servers as well.
Okay, got it. Now let's move on to talking about scaling API testing. Performance testing with Postman has become easier, but at what stage do you believe API performance testing should be introduced in their CLC, and how should teams balance it with functional testing?
Yeah, so I do give a few tips in my book on some things that you can consider from a performance testing perspective, and some of the ways that you can use performance testing tools, inside of Postman. And so I think it's something that, like, there should be a base level of things like performance testing, security, some of these more specialized forms of testing that every tester should be considering. So I think as testers, that should just be kind of built almost into your functional testing. You should be looking at, when I'm testing an API, like paying attention to, Postman tells you how long the request took, right? Like pay attention to that. See what it's doing. If you see like this request consistently seems slow, go and do some investigation, do some digging, look at some of the performance tools that Postman offers, and see if you can kind of find out where the problem is. So I think that kind of stuff should be happening really early in the process. It should be happening directly with your functional testing. You should be doing some kind of basic performance testing. You should be paying attention to performance characteristics, and hopefully finding some of those really obvious things early on. But I think that performance testing is a specialty for a reason as well. So it can be a tricky thing, and especially like in today's world where we have auto scaling. So performance testing is very dependent on the hardware that you're running on. And if you have, if your app is running in the cloud, it's probably running on scalable hardware, which means you can add more CPUs to it. You can add more memory to it. It might even have auto scaling happening, right? Where as more users start to interact with the app, it starts to scale up more compute nodes or more containers, whatever it is. And so it can be really tricky to do like accurate testing in those situations for like load test to performance. Um, the actual hardware requirements of your performance testing environment, how well do they need to match to your production, how fast do they scale up, how do the performance characteristics look in those details. So I think that kind of stuff often needs to be done by a specialized team with skills that are targeted towards performance and scalability testing, and tools that go far beyond what Postman can do. So I think there's a bit of a mix there. There's certainly some functional testing, and I'm glad that Postman provides some kind of introductory tools for performance testing there that help you do some of that, those basic catch the obvious things. But then when it comes to like the big scale, we want to see where the database contention might be, or how this app responds as it scales up past a certain number of nodes. Those kind of tests, I think, often they tend to need to involve some performance testing specialists.
Okay, great. Now let's talk about left testing and orchestration, which are trending. How do you see API test orchestration evolving, especially in CI/CD pipelines at scale?
Yeah, so shift left orchestration, these things, it's been trending for quite a while now. These are things that as an industry we've been investing in for years now, and we're seeing that those trends continue where we're pushing code testing closer to where the code is written. I think it's a great trend. We're seeing more thorough and complete API testing. Again, another great trend. I think APIs, as a little aside, in the world of AI, become even more important. That's like one of the primary ways that these AI agents and stuff are going to interact with your system. And so really having robust testing for your APIs is vital for companies. And so I think a positive trend that I've seen here is, in order to do these things, we need to speed up. We need to get more efficient tests as well. So we can't just take like these things are kind of in tension, right? Shift left and test orchestration. Like on the shift left side, we want to run stuff as close to the code as possible. We want quick, and the whole point of that is quick feedback loops. You want to write your code, you want to get feedback on it as quickly as possible. But then on the other side, the orchestration stuff, we're building out more complex orchestration systems. We're allowing for more broad coverage. And the more you do, the longer it takes to do it, right? Like that's just the way things work. And so those two things are in tension. And I think we're seeing a good trend here where we're pushing it towards the code, we're pushing it to the left, but we're also improving the speed that we can run at. And we're seeing people writing more efficient tests. We're seeing better hardware being used. And I think those kind of trends are evolving. We're seeing more parallelization. I think that's another one as well that is really important in this world where, to go back to something I said earlier, we need to make sure that our tests can run independently, because if we want to parallelize them, if we want to run multiple tests at the same time so that we can get that feedback quicker, we need to be able to run them independently. So I think those are some of the trends the positive trends that we're seeing right now on that front.
Brilliant. Now let's talk a little bit about the tooling ecosystem and enterprise readiness. And this is the last segment of our interview. So with tools like Hoppscotch and Insomnia maturing, how should teams evaluate whether to stick with Postman or diversify tooling across workflows?
Yeah, so I like playing around with new tools, but in general, my advice would be don't jump ship for the latest and greatest tool too quickly. I think it's fun. I understand, like, hey, there's a new tool, it's got these new features, I'm hearing all this buzz about it, and go for it, right? Try it out, see if you can use it. But also realize, like, early adopters, you face feature limitations when you got a new tool like Hoppscotch or Insomnia, Bruno, some of these new tools out there. They're they have some great thing. They have some, point of view that that they're taking into it, and that can be really valuable. Maybe that's helpful for the kinds of things that you're doing. But they're also going to have feature limitations. Postman has been around for a long time. They've got a lot of developers. They have the ability to add a lot of features, and these newer tools just aren't going to have as rich of a feature set. So when you're looking at a new tool, you need to really look at it, make sure it has the features that you need before you go jumping ship and pulling it over. And I think that's especially the case in bigger organizations where you have multiple teams using a tool, because the more people you have, the more different kind of ways they're going to use it, the more features they're going to depend on. And so that's not to say you should never leave a tool, but you should think about what feature limitations you might face. So like I, for example, recently I was trying out Bruno, and because let's try this out. Looks like a cool new tool. It's got some stuff, and it had some great features that I really liked. The way that they did changes, so the way that they did change management in their system is really great. I really like it. I like that approach. But then on the flip side, it didn't have some features that I really rely on a lot. And so I played around with it for a while. I tried it out on a project that I was working on, and tried implementing the project in Bruno. And at the end of it, I was like, you know what? I don't think we're quite ready to switch over to a tool like this. I still need to use Postman, and so I might still fire up Bruno once in a while to do something just it's interesting, and it can be useful, and it has some more simplicity to it. But we weren't ready to jump over to using it with everybody. So I think existing tools, new tools. It's great. Try them out, explore them, see what's out there, understand what's happening in the world of tooling. But don't be too quick to jump over to new tools just because it's the latest and greatest thing. And another thing I'll say on this too is that, like, existing tools will often add some cool features that the new tools come out with. A new tool might come out and it might have some new thing, and the existing tools will look at that and be like, you know what, we can add that in. Or you can try out the new tool. You can see, hey, look, it's got this feature. This would be really powerful. I really like this feature. I wish Postman had it. Well, you can go to Postman. You can submit a feature request. They have that ability. Go to their GitHub repo, and you can submit a feature request on there, or you can find maybe someone else already has, and you can chime in and say, yeah, I like this too. And so that's another thing as well, is go and look at these new tools and see what features they have, because you might discover some really good features, but then maybe you can just advocate for those features to be added to your existing tool.
Brilliant. Yeah. Talking about things that teams sort of need to be beware of, sort of like what you just described. Enterprise testing involves governance, observability, and collaboration. In your experience, what's one common mistake teams make when scaling API testing across squads, and how do you recommend they fix it?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've observed is kind of reinventing the wheel on their CI. So you'll see different teams, and every team will write their own CI. They might write their own wrapper around Newman, the command line runner for Postman, and they will integrate it into their system in a way that's similar to what other teams do, but not quite the same. And so I think you see a lot of this reinventing the wheel when it comes to CI and the way that we run the tests. So it might be shared conversations about, like, how are we going to structure our tests? How are we going to lay them out? How are we going to share, the way that we think about our tests at a structural level, or even at more detailed level, right? Like how are we going to do asserts? How are we going to do things like this? There's often thought and guidance put into that, but there isn't always into the CI. And so I think it depends on the structure of your company, how you want to go about addressing this. But in bigger companies where you've got, if you got testers embedded into the development squad, you may want to have a community of practice or some place where all the testers can gather together and talk about these common things. If you have a testing team or multiple testing teams, you might also want to provide some way for these testing teams to communicate with each other and provide some communication structures there. The exact details of what that looks like is going to vary from company to company, and what the structure of your company looks like, and how the testing and testers in your company look. But I would say something like a community of practice, and taking deliberate time to talk about, not just the tests and the testing, but also running the tests. How do you run these? What schedule do you run them on? Where in the CI do you put them? What are some of the best practices that we have for CI? Is there some way that we can share some of this CI code or infrastructure with each other as well? So I would say that's probably one of the common mistakes that I've seen is neglecting the CI side of things.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Dave. That brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you for taking the time out to talk about all this with us today. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Yeah, no problem. It was really fun to talk about this stuff. It's I said it in the interview, and it's a changing world out there with AI, and I think it's a world that makes APIs even more important. So I'm excited to continue the conversation about APIs and API testing.
Wonderful. And for our viewers watching, if you want more real-world insights and examples, do check out Dave's book, API Testing and Development with Postman. You'll find the link in the description. See you next time.